Hello and welcome. Imagine for a moment that you wake up one morning and the very laws of physics have changed. Gravity no longer pulls you down with the same reliable force. Light bends in impossible directions. The air you breathe carries a strange charge that makes your skin tingle with power or pain. Now imagine that this change is not localized to your bedroom or your city, but spreads across your entire world, your entire plane of existence. This is what happened in the year 1485 Dale Reckoning, when the Spellplague tore through Toril and fundamentally changed everything you thought you knew about magic, about the gods, and about the very fabric of reality itself. But to truly understand the Spellplague, you need to first understand what came before it. You need to know what was lost. In the time before the Spellplague, magic in Faerun worked through something called the Weave. Picture the Weave as an intricate network of energy that permeated every corner of existence. It was the medium through which raw magical energy flowed, the conduit that allowed mortals to shape reality according to their will. When you cast a spell, you were not creating magic from nothing. You were reaching into this weave, pulling on its threads, and channeling its power through carefully learned patterns and formulae. The weave was not a natural phenomenon. It was a divine creation, maintained and supervised by the goddess Mystra, the mother of all magic, the Lady of Mysteries. She was the personification of the weave itself, and her consciousness was spread throughout every thread of magical energy that existed. When you cast even the simplest cantrip, when you lit a torch with a word of power, or mended a torn cloak with a gesture, Mystra was aware of it. She felt every spell, every enchantment, every magical effect that occurred anywhere in the multiverse where her weave extended its reach. Mystra had held this role for centuries, though she was not the first to bear the name. The goddess of magic had died and been reborn before, each time with a different mortal ascending to take on the divine mantle, but the weave itself remained constant, a fundamental force of the cosmos that existed beyond any single incarnation of its keeper. Or so everyone believed. Under Mystra's guidance, magic was orderly and predictable. Yes, there were wild magic zones where the weave frayed and spells behaved unpredictably. Yes, there were dead magic zones where the weave simply did not exist and no spell could function. But these were exceptions, aberrations. For the most part, if you learned the proper words, the correct gestures, the right components, you could reliably produce the same magical effect every single time. A fireball spell would create a fireball. A healing spell would mend wounds. A divination would reveal hidden knowledge. This reliability was what made magical civilization possible. Wizards could dedicate their lives to studying the arcane arts because they knew their research would yield consistent results. Clerics could call upon their gods for divine intervention because the channels of power remained open and stable. Sorcerers could trust in their innate abilities because the fundamental laws of magic did not shift and change from day to day. The world you lived in before the Spellplague was one where magic was deeply woven into the fabric of society. Not everyone could cast spells, of course. Most people lived ordinary lives, farming and crafting and trading, without ever touching the weave directly. But magic was always there, shaping the world around you in both subtle and obvious ways. Great cities rose higher than should have been possible because of magical reinforcement. Waterdeep, the city of splendors, stood as a testament to what could be achieved when magic and mortal ingenuity worked together. Its towers reached toward the sky, held aloft by enchantments woven into their very foundations. Its harbor remained ice-free even in the depths of winter through careful application of weather magic. Its streets were patrolled by magical constructs and divination spells that helped the city watch maintain order. In Halrua, the land of wizard kings in the far south, magic was not just common, but mandatory for anyone who wished to hold real power. The nation's entire culture revolved around magical prowess. Children were tested at young ages to determine their aptitude for the art, and those who showed promise were given the best education the realm could provide. Skyships filled the air above Halruan cities, kept aloft by powerful enchantments, and piloted by skilled wizards. The borders of the nation were protected by massive magical wards that could detect and destroy threats before they ever reached populated areas. Even in lands where magic was less central to daily life, it still played a crucial role. Merchants relied on magical means of communication to conduct trade across vast distances. Farmers in some regions used minor enchantments to improve their crops or protect their livestock from predators and disease. Healers combined mundane medicine with divine magic to cure ailments that would otherwise be fatal. The great magical institutions of the age held tremendous influence. The Spellguard of Silverimoon maintained order in that civilized realm through a combination of martial prowess and arcane might. The War Wizards of Cormor served as both the nation's magical defense force and its internal security apparatus, answering only to the crown itself. The Gentarim, though often viewed as villains by those who opposed them, demonstrated how magical power could be leveraged to build a vast network of influence and control. Academies and colleges dedicated to magical study dotted the landscape. The Blackstaff Academy in Waterdeep trained some of the finest wizards in all of Faerun. Candlekeep, the great library fortress on the Sword Coast, housed countless magical tomes and scrolls, preserving knowledge that dated back thousands of years. Individual wizards maintained their own towers and sanctums, places where they could conduct research away from prying eyes, and where apprentices came to learn at the feet of masters. The magic you knew before the Spellplague operated according to well-understood principles. These were not laws written in any book or decreed by any authority. but rather fundamental truths that generations of spellcasters had discovered through careful observation and experimentation. First among these principles was the concept of spell levels. Magic was organized into distinct tiers of power, ranging from simple cantrips that even a novice could master to 9th level spells that only the most accomplished archmages could hope to cast. This hierarchy was not arbitrary. It reflected the amount of energy required to produce a given effect and the complexity of the mental patterns needed to shape that energy properly. A first-level spell like Magic Missile required minimal power and a relatively simple mental construct. You could visualize the effect clearly, channel a small amount of energy through the weave, and produce glowing darts of force that unerringly struck your target. Even a wizard fresh from their apprenticeship could manage such a feat multiple times per day. But a 9th level spell like Wish was another matter entirely. To cast Wish, you needed not only vast reserves of personal power, but also the mental discipline to hold an incredibly complex pattern in your mind, while channeling enough energy to reshape reality itself. The strain of casting such magic was immense, and even powerful archmages could only do so sparingly. Some who attempted Wish found themselves drained of all magical ability for days afterward, or discovered that the spell had exacted an unexpected price for granting their desire. Between these extremes lay a full spectrum of magical effects. Second-level spells like Invisibility or Web provided useful tactical options without overtaxing your resources. 4th-level spells like Wall of Fire or Greater Invisibility offered significant power, but required more training and experience to master. 7th-level spells like Teleport or Resurrection bordered on the miraculous, allowing you to traverse vast distances instantaneously or return the dead to life. The limitation on how many spells you could cast in a given day was another fundamental aspect of how magic worked. When you cast a spell, you were not just channeling energy through the weave, you were also creating complex mental patterns, geometric shapes, and mathematical formulae that existed in your mind and shaped the raw magical energy into the specific effect you desired. Creating and maintaining these patterns required intense concentration and mental effort. After casting a spell, that particular mental pattern would dissolve, fading from your mind like a dream upon waking. To cast the same spell again, you would need to rebuild that pattern from scratch, and this required time and rest. Wizards prepared their spells each day during long study sessions, carefully constructing the mental frameworks they would need. Sorcerers, who drew on innate magical ability rather than learned knowledge, still found themselves mentally exhausted after casting too many spells and needed time to recover. There were ways to enhance your casting ability, of course. Magical items like wands, staves, and rings could provide additional power or allow you to cast certain spells without expending your own mental resources. Powerful wizards created permanent magical effects that did not require ongoing concentration, allowing them to surround themselves with protective wards and beneficial enchantments. Some spellcasters learned meta-magic techniques that allowed them to modify their spells in various ways, making them more powerful, longer lasting, or harder to resist. Divine magic operated on slightly different principles than arcane magic, but it still relied on the weave as its medium. When a cleric or paladin called upon their deity for aid, they were not directly channeling the god's power. Instead, they were asking their deity to work through the weave on their behalf, to shape magical energy according to the deity's will rather than their own. This meant that divine spellcasters were limited in different ways than arcane casters. They could not simply learn any spell they wished. Instead, they had access only to those magics that aligned with their deity's portfolio, and that their god was willing to grant them. The relationship between spellcaster and deity was one of partnership and devotion. A cleric who betrayed their god's principles might find themselves cut off from divine power entirely, but a faithful servant could sometimes receive miraculous aid in dire circumstances, channeling power beyond what their experience level would normally allow. The existence of reliable, powerful magic created its own set of challenges for society. How do you govern a world where a single individual with sufficient magical training can level buildings, dominate minds, or alter the course of rivers? How do you maintain order when some citizens have access to powers that others can barely comprehend? Different nations and cultures found different answers to these questions. In Cormer, the Crown maintained strict control over magical activity through the War Wizards. Anyone who wished to practice magic within Cormer's borders needed to register with the authorities and submit to occasional inspections to ensure they were not engaged in any illegal activities. Unauthorized spellcasting, particularly of powerful magics, could result in arrest and imprisonment. In Thay, by contrast, the Red Wizards ruled openly through magical might. The nation was organized into regional Tharshans, each governed by a powerful wizard who maintained their position through a combination of magical power, political cunning, and sometimes sheer ruthlessness. The common people of Thay lived under the dominion of their magical overlords, and rebellion was brutally suppressed through spells that could kill from miles away or animate the dead into unliving servants. Waterdeep attempted to find a middle ground. The city welcomed wizards and encouraged magical research, but also maintained various safeguards to prevent any single spellcaster from gaining too much influence. The Lords of Waterdeep, the masked nobles who truly ruled the city, included several powerful wizards among their number. But there were also warriors, merchants, and other non-spellcasters who could provide balance and prevent magical tyranny. The churches of various deities also played a crucial role in maintaining magical order. Good-aligned gods like Tyr and Torm encouraged their followers to use divine magic in service of justice and righteousness. Evil deities like Bane and Cyric pushed their servants to use magic as a tool of domination and cruelty. Neutral gods like Mystra herself took a more hands-off approach, caring more about the responsible use of magic than about the specific purposes to which it was put. Mystra, in particular, worked to prevent magical catastrophes. She had established certain prohibitions on specific types of magic that she deemed too dangerous. Spells that affected large numbers of people simultaneously, or that could permanently alter reality, were restricted to only the most trusted and experienced casters. When someone attempted to create a new spell that crossed these boundaries, Mystra herself might intervene, appearing to the caster in a vision or dream to warn them away from their research. This is the world you knew. This is the reality you inhabited before everything changed. Magic was powerful but predictable, dangerous but controllable. The weave provided structure and order to the chaotic energies that permeated the cosmos. Mystra watched over all of it, a divine guardian ensuring that magic would remain a force for civilization rather than destruction. You took this for granted, as people always take their reality for granted. You assumed that the weave would always be there, that spells would always work the way they had worked for centuries, that the fundamental rules of magic were as unchangeable as the rising and setting of the sun. You were wrong, and the terrible truth that you were about to learn was this: when a goddess dies, when the weave collapses, when the very laws of magic unravel, the consequences are beyond anything you could have imagined. The Spellplague was not just a disaster. It was an apocalypse, a fundamental rewriting of reality itself. But that catastrophe did not come out of nowhere. It had causes, architects, conspirators who worked in shadow to bring about the fall of Mystra and the destruction of the weave. To understand the Spellplague, you need to understand the murder that triggered it. And that requires us to turn our attention to two gods whose hatred and ambition would doom an entire world. Section 2: The Conspiracy and Murder of Mystra. The plot to kill Mystra began not with a single moment of decision, but with centuries of festering hatred, divine ambition, and the slow corruption of an already unstable mind. You must understand that gods are not immune to the weaknesses that plague mortals. They feel jealousy, rage, and desire for power just as intensely as any human tyrant or ambitious warlord. The difference is that when a god succumbs to these impulses, when divine power is turned toward destructive ends, the consequences ripple across entire worlds. Cyric, the Prince of Lies, the Dark Sun, had never been stable. Even before his apotheosis, when he was still mortal, he had been prone to paranoia and megalomania. He had been a member of a group of adventurers who had, through a series of events during the time of troubles, ended up claiming the divine essence of several dead gods. Cyric had absorbed the portfolios of murder, lies, and intrigue, becoming a god of deception and death. But godhood had not brought him peace or satisfaction. Instead, it had amplified every flaw in his character, magnifying his worst impulses until they consumed him entirely. As a god, Cyric could not be killed by conventional means, but he could be driven mad. And that is exactly what happened. The catalyst for Cyric's complete descent into insanity was a book. Not just any book, but the Cyric, a tome that he himself had commissioned. Cyric had ordered his followers to write a biography that portrayed him as the greatest of all gods, the one true deity deserving of universal worship. The book was infused with powerful enchantments that made anyone who read it believe its contents completely and absolutely. But Cyric made a fatal mistake. He read his own book. The enchantments that were meant to convert others to his worship worked on him as well. And Cyric became convinced of his own absolute supremacy. Every word written in the Cyric became truth in his mind. He truly believed that he was the greatest god, that all other deities were inferior pretenders, that the entire multiverse should bow before him and acknowledge his supreme authority. This delusion festered and grew over the years following the time of troubles. Cyric became increasingly erratic and unstable, lashing out at perceived slights and conspiracies that existed only in his diseased mind. Other gods began to avoid him when possible, wary of triggering one of his violent outbursts. Even his own followers found him difficult to serve, as his commands often contradicted each other or made no logical sense. But there was one deity who saw opportunity in Cyric's madness. Shar, the Lady of Loss, the mistress of the night, was one of the most ancient and powerful gods in existence. She had existed since before the current world was formed, a primal force of darkness and entropy. Where her twin sister Selûne represented light and creation, Shar embodied shadow and destruction. She sought nothing less than the unmaking of reality itself, a return to the primordial void that had existed before the gods shaped the cosmos. Shar was patient. She had waited for eons, watching civilizations rise and fall, seeing gods ascend and perish. She understood that sometimes the best way to achieve your goals was not through direct action, but through careful manipulation of others. And in Cyric, she saw the perfect tool for her purposes. Mystra stood as one of the greatest obstacles to Shar's ultimate plans. The weave represented order and structure, the very things that Shar despised. As long as the weave existed, as long as magic flowed in predictable patterns according to established rules, reality would remain stable. But if Mystra could be eliminated, if the weave could be destroyed, the resulting chaos would serve Shar's goals beautifully. Shar began to whisper to Cyric in his moments of paranoid fury. She did not appear to him directly or announce her involvement. Instead, she worked through dreams and visions, planting suggestions in his mind that would take root and grow. She reminded him of past conflicts with Mystra, who in her mortal life had been known as Midnight, and had adventured alongside Cyric before her ascension. She pointed out how the goddess of magic was beloved by mortals, while he was feared and hated. She suggested that Mystra was secretly working against him, plotting to strip him of his divine power and cast him down into oblivion. None of this was true, of course. Mystra had no particular interest in Cyric beyond the general wariness that all gods felt toward him. She was far too busy maintaining the weave and managing the countless responsibilities that came with being the goddess of magic to waste time on elaborate conspiracies against the Prince of Lies. But truth did not matter to Cyric. In his madness, fueled by the Cyrinishad's enchantments and Shar's poisonous whispers, he became absolutely convinced that Mystra posed an existential threat to him. Shar also made promises. She told Cyric that if he destroyed Mystra, he could claim her portfolio and her power for himself. He could become the god of magic as well as lies and murder, expanding his domain and his influence. She painted visions of a future where Cyric ruled over arcane forces as well as deception, where all spellcasters would be forced to worship him or lose access to magic entirely. The audacity of the plan appealed to Cyric's megalomania. The thought of himself as the supreme god of magic, controlling the very force that shaped reality, aligned perfectly with the delusions the Cyrinishad had created in his mind. He began to plot in earnest, drawing on his portfolio of intrigue to devise a scheme that would allow him to strike at Mystra directly. But killing a god is not a simple matter, even for another deity. Mystra was powerful, and she was protected by numerous wards and safeguards. She also had allies among the other gods, who would certainly intervene if they learned of a plot against her. Cyric would need to be clever. He would need to strike when Mystra was vulnerable, and he would need to do so in a way that prevented other deities from coming to her aid in time. Shar provided crucial assistance, though always from the shadows where her involvement could not be traced. She used her power over darkness and secrets to conceal Cyric's preparations from divine notice. She helped him identify moments when Mystra's attention was divided, when the goddess was focused on maintaining the weave in areas where it had grown unstable. She even used her influence to create small crises that would distract other gods who might otherwise have detected Cyric's hostile intentions. On the 29th day of Tarsak in the year 1400, an 85-dale reckoning Cyric struck. The exact details of how he managed to confront Mystra remain somewhat unclear, pieced together from fragmentary accounts and divine revelations that filtered down to mortal scholars. What is known is that Cyric ambushed Mystra in her own divine realm of Tuomerheart, a place that existed partially within the astral plane and partially in a dimension of pure magical energy. Dweomerheart was where Mystra went to directly commune with the weave, to perform the delicate work of maintaining balance and order in the flow of magic across countless worlds. It should have been one of the safest places in the multiverse for her, protected by wards that would alert her to any intrusion, and defended by celestial servants utterly loyal to her cause. But Shar's influence allowed Cyric to bypass these defenses. The Lady of Loss used her dominion over shadow to create blind spots in Mystra's awareness, moments where the goddess of magic did not perceive what was happening in parts of her own realm. Through these gaps, Cyric infiltrated Dweomerheart with murderous intent. When Mystra realized what was happening, when she finally became aware that Cyric had penetrated her sanctum, she attempted to defend herself. She was not a war goddess, but she was far from helpless. She commanded magic itself, and in Dweomerheart, she had access to the full power of the weave without any of the limitations that constrained mortal spellcasters. What followed was a confrontation of divine proportions. Based on what occurred afterward, we can infer that Mystra unleashed forces that would have vaporized entire nations if they had been released on the material plane. She wove spells of such complexity and power that they bordered on the impossible, reality-altering magics that only the goddess of magic herself could have produced. She called out for aid, sending psychic cries across the plains to any god who might hear and come to her assistance. But Shar ensured that these calls for help went unheard or were delayed just long enough to matter. She wove shadows around Dweomerheart, dampening the signals that would otherwise have alerted the divine community to Mystra's peril. By the time other gods realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Cyric, empowered by his own divine essence and by the dark blessings Shar had secretly bestowed upon him, weathered Mystra's assault. His madness gave him a kind of terrible focus, a singular determination that allowed him to press forward with his attack. The killing blow came, and Mystra's divine form was shattered. Her divine essence began to unravel, bleeding away into the surrounding ether. She tried to hold herself together, to maintain coherence long enough to pass her power on to a chosen successor, as previous incarnations of the goddess had done when they died. But whatever methods Cyric employed, whatever divine power he wielded in that final moment, prevented even this. Mystra could not preserve any significant portion of her divine power for future use. In her final moments, Mystra understood what was about to happen. She knew that her death would not be a simple transition of power from one goddess to another. She was too deeply intertwined with the weave itself. Her consciousness permeated every thread of magical energy in existence. When she died, the weave would die with her, or at the very least be catastrophically damaged. She tried to warn everyone, she sent out one last desperate message, a psychic scream that reached across the plains to touch the mind of every being with even a spark of magical ability. Spellcasters experienced this as a sudden, overwhelming certainty that something terrible was about to happen, a premonition of doom that struck without warning or explanation. Most did not understand what they were experiencing. They felt a moment of existential dread, a brief flash of absolute terror, and then Mystra was gone, and the message vanished with her. The goddess of magic died. Tuiomerheart exploded in a cataclysmic detonation that sent shockwaves through multiple planes of existence. Cyric stood in the aftermath, triumphant, and already planning how he would claim Mystra's portfolio for himself. But claiming the portfolio of a slain deity requires more than simply killing them. You must be able to take their divine power into yourself, to integrate their domain with your own. And Cyric discovered in that moment that he could not do this with Mystra's power. The magic domain was too large, too complex, too fundamentally different from his own nature as a god of lies and murder. It was like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. The power simply would not fit within him. Cyric raged at this failure, his madness reaching new heights as he realized that his grand plan had not succeeded the way he had envisioned. He had killed Mystra, yes, but he had not gained her power. Instead, he had simply destroyed it, scattering it to the winds where no one could claim it. And then the consequences began. The weave, already damaged by the trauma of Mystra's death, began to unravel completely. Without the goddess's consciousness to maintain its structure, without her will to hold the threads of magical energy in their proper patterns, the entire system began to collapse. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. A few spells fizzled or produced unexpected effects. Some magical items flickered and went dark. Wizards experienced difficulty preparing their daily spells, finding that the mental patterns they usually constructed seemed to slip away from their grasp. But within hours, the decay accelerated. The threads of the weave began snapping under the strain, breaking apart and releasing their stored energy in chaotic bursts. Each break created a cascade effect, putting additional stress on the remaining threads and causing them to break as well. It was like watching a rope unravel, starting with a few loose fibers and quickly progressing to total disintegration. You felt it happening if you had any magical ability at all. Wizards who were in the middle of casting spells found their magic going wild, producing effects completely different from what they had intended. Some were killed instantly as fireballs exploded in their own faces or lightning bolts struck them instead of their targets. Others found themselves trapped in extra-dimensional spaces that suddenly collapsed, crushed by the weight of reality reasserting itself where it should not exist. Clerics discovered that their connection to their deities had become unstable. Divine magic still functioned because it was channeled through faith and the direct intervention of gods rather than through the weave. But even divine casters experienced disruptions. Healing spells sometimes caused harm instead. Protective wards flickered and failed. The carefully maintained balance between divine will and mortal casting had been thrown into chaos by the weave's collapse. Sorcerers suffered perhaps worst of all. Their magic came from within, from bloodlines touched by dragons or demons or other magical beings. They were more intimately connected to the weave than wizards because their power was instinctive rather than learned. When the weave collapsed, many sorcerers felt as if their very souls were being torn apart. Some died on the spot, their bodies unable to contain the magical energy that suddenly had nowhere to go. Others survived, but lost their powers entirely, becoming mundane humans overnight. And then the blue fire appeared. This was the visible manifestation of the weave's destruction. The actual magical energy that had been contained within those invisible threads, now released all at once. It looked like flames, but it was not truly fire. It was raw magic, uncontrolled and destructive, burning across the landscape in waves that followed the old paths the weave had taken. The blue fire moved like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. Buildings were vaporized in seconds. Forests burned to ash. Mountains crumbled as the magical energy destabilized the very rock they were made from. And people, thousands upon thousands of people, were caught in the blue fire's path. Most died instantly, their bodies unable to withstand direct exposure to that much uncontrolled magical power. Those who survived the initial contact were changed, twisted by the magic, into something no longer quite human. The blue fire was not merely destructive, it was transformative, mutagenic reality warping. Where it passed, the normal laws of nature ceased to apply. Gravity reversed itself, or simply stopped working entirely. Time flowed at different rates, speeding up in some areas and slowing down in others. The boundaries between planes of existence became thin and permeable, allowing creatures and energies from other dimensions to spill through into the material world. Entire regions were consumed by what came to be called plaguelands, areas where the Spellplague's effects were so intense that normal life could not exist. These zones glowed with residual magical energy, and anyone who entered them without protection risked being killed or horribly transformed. Some plaguelands were relatively stable, maintaining consistent, if alien, physical laws. Others were constantly shifting, changing from moment to moment in ways that made them completely impassable. The devastation was not limited to Toril, the world that held Faerun. The weave had extended throughout the entire crystal sphere, and its collapse affected every planet and plane connected to it. The Underdark, the vast network of caverns and tunnels beneath Faerun's surface, experienced catastrophic cave-ins as magical supports failed, and the rock above came crashing down. even other planes of existence felt the impact. The Feywild and the Shadowfell, echo planes that existed alongside the material world, were thrown into turmoil as the barriers between them and the prime material plane weakened, and in some places disappeared entirely. Regions of Faerun suddenly found themselves overlapping with the Feywild, blending the mortal world with the realm of Faerie in chaotic and unpredictable ways. And you, if you were alive when this happened, experienced it firsthand. Maybe you were a wizard who felt your carefully memorized spells evaporate from your mind. Maybe you were a farmer who watched blue fire consume your fields and your home. Maybe you were a merchant in a city when the ground began to shake, and buildings started to float upward, torn free from the earth by the breakdown of natural law. You watched the world end. You watched reality itself come unraveled at the seams. And you understood, in that moment of absolute horror, that nothing would ever be the same again. The old world, the world where magic was reliable and predictable, where the weave provided structure and Mystra provided guidance, that world was gone forever. The Spellplague had begun, and its blue flames were only the first manifestation of the catastrophe that would reshape Toril and all its inhabitants for over a century to come. Section 3. The Spellplague Unleashed. The blue fire spread across Faerun like a wildfire across dry grassland, but infinitely more terrible and infinitely more strange. You need to understand that this was not a normal disaster, not an earthquake or a hurricane or even a volcanic eruption. Those catastrophes, as devastating as they can be, still operate according to the laws of nature. They follow predictable patterns. They cause damage that can be understood and eventually repaired. The Spellplague followed no such rules. It was the breakdown of magic itself, the unraveling of forces that had held reality together since the gods first shaped the world from primordial chaos. When the blue fire touched something, it did not simply destroy it. It changed it, warped it, twisted it into forms that should not exist according to any natural law. The first manifestation of the Spellplague struck in the Emhyr jungles, west of Halriwa, in the year 1400, and 85 Dale reckoning. One moment, the world was normal, or as normal as it ever was in a realm filled with magic and monsters. The next moment, the sky itself seemed to catch fire with blue flames that burned, but produced no heat, that consumed, but left strange residues rather than ash. People looked up and saw the heavens blazing with this impossible fire, and many fell to their knees in terror, certain that the end of all things had come. They were not entirely wrong. The blue fire was raw magical energy, the same force that had flowed through the weave, but now released from all constraint and structure. Imagine taking a river that had flowed in a controlled channel for thousands of years, and suddenly removing all the banks, all the stones and earth that directed its course. The water would spread everywhere, flooding the land and destroying everything in its path. The blue fire was like that, except instead of water, it was pure arcane power. And instead of simply flooding, it was rewriting the fundamental rules of existence wherever it touched. When the blue fire made contact with living creatures, the effects varied wildly. Some were killed instantly, their bodies simply unable to withstand the energy pouring through them. They burned from the inside out, though the flames left behind bodies that were often strangely intact, frozen in their final moments, with expressions of agony or terror on their faces. Others survived the initial contact, but were transformed. These individuals became what would later be known as either spell-scarred or plague-changed, depending on the severity of their alteration. The spell-scarred retained their essential humanity, but bore marks and gained abilities from their exposure. The plague-changed, however, were twisted into something far more monstrous. Their bodies warped into aberrant forms that bore little resemblance to what they had been before. The spell-scarred found their bodies marked in ways both subtle and dramatic. Some developed patches of blue-glowing skin that crackled with residual magical energy. Others discovered that parts of their body had been replaced with different materials entirely. Flesh might become stone or crystal, or even stranger substances that had no name in any mortal language. These marks were permanent, and they often granted strange abilities that were neither true spells nor purely mundane talents. The plague-changed suffered far worse fates. Their transformations were complete and horrible, turning them into creatures that resembled aberrations more than humanoids. Extra limbs might sprout from their bodies, or their heads might split into multiple faces. Some grew to enormous sizes, while others shrank to barely recognizable forms. The plague-changed often lost their minds along with their bodies, becoming savage creatures driven by instinct and pain rather than rational thought. The physical transformation of the landscape was perhaps even more dramatic than the changes inflicted on living beings. The blue fire did not respect borders or boundaries. It flowed across nations and continents, and where it burned most intensely, the very ground was torn apart. Massive chunks of earth and stone were ripped free from the surface and hurled into the sky, where they defied gravity and remained floating hundreds or even thousands of feet above the ground. These earth motes, as they came to be called, ranged in size from small islands barely large enough to hold a house to massive flying mountains that could support entire ecosystems. The creation of earth motes was violent and terrifying. If you were standing on ground that was about to become an earth mote, you would feel the earth begin to shake and heave beneath your feet. Then, with a sound like the world being torn in half, the ground would suddenly lurch upward, breaking free from the surrounding terrain and beginning its ascent into the sky. Anyone who did not manage to hold onto something was thrown off the edge and fell to their death on the ground far below. The earth motes did not simply float in place once they reached their final altitude. Many of them drifted slowly through the air, following invisible currents of magical energy that still persisted even after the weave's collapse. Some earth motes traveled in predictable patterns, circling the same area repeatedly. Others wandered erratically, making navigation and long-term habitation difficult for anyone living on them. The earth motes were not the only geographic changes wrought by the Spellplague. Entire regions were simply erased from existence, replaced by zones of crackling blue energy that persisted for years afterward. Lakes appeared where there had been dry land. Mountains crumbled into dust. Rivers changed their courses or disappeared entirely, leaving their former beds as dry channels cutting across the landscape. One of the most dramatic alterations was the creation of the Underchasm, a massive rift that split southeastern Faerun from Akinul to the borders of Halriwa. The Underchasm was several hundred miles wide and opened directly into the Underdark, exposing the vast underground realm to the surface in ways that had never occurred before. The chasm glowed with residual blue fire and was filled with planar distortions that made traversing it extremely dangerous. But perhaps the most shocking transformation was the exchange of land masses between Toril and its twin world, a bear. The Spellplague weakened the barriers that had kept these two worlds separate since their creation, and in some places, those barriers collapsed entirely. Whole regions were swapped between the two planets, taking their inhabitants with them whether they wanted to go or not. The entire continent of Mastica, far to the west of Faerun, vanished from Toril and was replaced by Larikond, a continent from a bear that became known as Return to Bear. The people of Mastica found themselves suddenly on an alien world, while the Dragonborn and other inhabitants of Larikond were equally shocked to discover themselves on Toril. Different regions of Faerun experienced different levels of destruction based on factors that were not entirely understood. Some areas that had been magical centers, places where the weave had been particularly strong, were hit hardest. Other locations seemed to be affected almost at random, suggesting that the collapsing weave was lashing out in its death throes without rhyme or reason. Halriwa, the southern land of wizard kings, faced annihilation. This was a nation that had built its entire civilization on magic, where every aspect of daily life was infused with arcane power. The Halruan diviners had foreseen Mystra's death through their prophecies and had prepared for the catastrophe as best they could. Using ancient Netherese magic, they had constructed an intricate network of mythals and forcewebs, powerful magical structures designed to protect their nation. When the Spellplague struck, these Halruan wizards made a desperate gambit. At tremendous cost to themselves, they used the forcewebs to shift most of their kingdom sideways through reality, transporting it to the parallel world of a bear. This saved a significant portion of Halriwa and its population. Though what life awaited them on that alien world was uncertain and difficult. But fully half of Halriwa dissolved in the initial wave of blue fire, and what remained on Toril after the translocation was utterly destroyed. The skyships that filled the air above Halriwan cities all fell simultaneously, as the enchantments keeping them aloft failed. Tsunamis, mudslides, and massive magical detonations followed, obliterating the remainder of the nation in a cataclysm that could be felt as far away as Waterdeep. Lanton, an island nation of inventors and artificers, suffered a similar fate. The Lantonese had specialized in combining magic with mechanical devices and alchemical compounds, creating wondrous items that blended arcane power with clever engineering. When the Spellplague hit, all of these devices failed or went haywire simultaneously. The smoke powder stores that the Lantonese had accumulated exploded all at once, creating a chain reaction of devastating force. Then massive waves spawned by the reshaping of continents crashed against the island's shores. Most of Lanton was engulfed by blue fire and transported to a bear, while what remained on Toril was completely flooded, killing the remaining Lantonese and sweeping away their advanced technology beneath the waves. The region that had once held Myth-Draenor, an ancient elven metropolis that had been the pinnacle of magical achievement in ages past, experienced its own catastrophe. The city had been in ruins since its fall centuries earlier, but those ruins still contained vast amounts of residual magical energy. This could have made Myth-Draenor particularly vulnerable to the Spellplague, though the full details of what occurred there during this period suggest a more complex situation involving the returned Netherese and struggles over the city's mythal. What can be said with certainty is that the region was heavily affected by the Spellplague's chaotic energies. Thay, the land of the Red Wizards, was heavily damaged but not destroyed. The Red Wizards had experience dealing with dangerous magic, and some of them managed to erect hasty wards that provided limited protection from the blue fire. But even with these preparations, they lost entire cities. The magical energies released by the Spellplague's passage through this magic-saturated land created zones of wild magic and dead magic that persisted for decades. The Dalelands, a region of small farming communities and independent settlements, were struck unevenly. Some dales were completely untouched, their residents watching in horror as the sky burned, but experiencing no direct effects themselves. Other dales were hit by massive waves of blue fire that killed everyone within their borders. The survivors in the untouched dales suddenly found themselves isolated, cut off from neighboring communities by impassable plaguelands or great chasms that had opened in the earth. Waterdeep, the great city on the Sword Coast, was more fortunate than many population centers. The city's position meant that it was only grazed by the Spellplague rather than struck directly. But even this glancing blow was devastating. Portions of the city were consumed by blue fire. Several of the city's towers collapsed as magical reinforcements failed. The harbor experienced turbulent magical energies that capsized ships and damaged the docks. The city's defenders, including the Blackstaff and other powerful wizards, fought desperately to contain the damage. They erected barriers where they could, trying to channel the blue fire away from populated areas. They teleported people out of danger zones when such magic still functioned, and used what remained of their power to stabilize buildings that were on the verge of collapse. But their efforts could only do so much. Waterdeep survived, but it was scarred by the experience. The Sea of Fallen Stars, the great inland sea that sat at the heart of Faerun, was dramatically affected by the reshaping of continents and the planar exchanges. Portions of the seafloor were thrust upward in some areas, while dropping away into abyssal trenches in others. Coastal cities found themselves suddenly miles inland as the shoreline reconfigured itself, or underwater as the sea level shifted. The exact changes varied by region, but the sea that emerged from the Spellplague was different in both shape and nature from what had existed before. The material plane was not the only realm affected by the Spellplague. The collapse of the weave weakened the barriers between different planes of existence, allowing energy and creatures to pass between them far more easily than should have been possible. This planar bleeding created situations that defied all conventional understanding of how the multiverse was supposed to work. Areas of Faerun began to overlap with the Feywild, the bright and chaotic realm of fairy creatures and wild magic. Trees in these overlap zones would shift from normal oak and pine to strange fey vegetation that glowed with inner light and moved of its own accord. Time flowed differently in these areas, with travelers sometimes emerging to find that hours had passed when they thought they had been gone for only minutes, or vice versa. The Feywild bleeding brought its inhabitants along with it. Fey creatures that had never been seen on the material plane before suddenly appeared in the mortal world. Some were benign or even helpful, offering assistance to confused and frightened mortals. But many Fey were dangerous, viewing humans as playthings or prey. The Shadowfell, the dark mirror of the material plane, also began to merge with parts of Faerun. Where the Shadowfell touched the mortal world, color drained away, and shadows became unnaturally deep and threatening. Living creatures in these zones found themselves becoming lethargic and depressed, overcome by the Shadowfell's inherent gloom. Worse than the environmental effects were the undead that came with the Shadowfell. Wraiths, specters, and other incorporeal undead could cross the weakened barriers with ease, emerging from pools of darkness to attack the living. Some of these undead were mindless, driven only by an instinctive hatred of life. Others retained intelligence and malicious intent, using their abilities to terrorize entire communities. The lower planes also began to intrude on the material plane. Demons and devils found it easier to cross over, whether answering summons that wizards foolishly attempted in the chaotic magical environment, or arriving of their own initiative. Some took advantage of the chaos to establish footholds in the mortal world, setting themselves up as warlords or false gods, and demanding worship from frightened survivors. If you were a wizard or sorcerer when the Spellplague struck, your experience was particularly horrifying. Magic had been your life, your power, your identity. You had spent years, perhaps decades, learning to manipulate the weave, to shape magical energy according to your will. And then suddenly, in the span of a few hours, everything you knew became useless or actively dangerous. The spells you had memorized, the careful mental constructs you had built up through rigorous study and practice, simply evaporated. You reached for them and found nothing, like trying to remember a word that sits just on the tip of your tongue, but will not come. The formulae and gestures that had always produced reliable effects now did nothing at all. Or worse, produced effects completely different from what you intended. Sorcerers faced a different but equally terrible problem. Their magic came from within, from bloodlines touched by dragons or demons or elemental forces. When the weave collapsed, it disrupted the internal magical currents that flowed through their bodies. Many sorcerers died as their own power turned against them, burning them from the inside out. Those who survived often found their abilities changed in fundamental ways, no longer under their conscious control. Divine casters fared somewhat better, but even they were not immune to the chaos. The gods still existed and could still grant power to their faithful followers. But the channels through which divine magic flowed had been damaged by the weave's collapse. Clerics and paladins found that their prayers were sometimes answered and sometimes ignored, with no clear pattern to when their deity would respond. Magic items, those reliable tools that spellcasters and warriors alike had depended on for centuries, became wildly unpredictable. Some continued to function normally, their enchantments stable enough to survive the weave's collapse. Others lost their power entirely, becoming mundane objects overnight. Still others became cursed, their magic twisted into malevolent forms that harmed their wielders. The most dangerous were items that had contained vast amounts of magical power. Artifacts and legendary weapons sometimes exploded when the weave collapsed, killing anyone nearby. Bags of holding and portable holes inverted themselves, spewing their contents across vast distances or creating localized implosions. Flying carpets fell from the sky. Protective rings failed at critical moments. The world you had known, the world where magic was a tool to be mastered and used, was gone. In its place was a nightmare landscape where magic was as likely to kill you as save you, where the old certainties had been replaced by chaos and terror. And this was not a temporary situation, not a disaster that would be cleaned up in a few months or years. The Spellplague had fundamentally broken reality, and it would take over a century before the damage could even begin to be repaired. In the meantime, you and everyone else who survived had to learn to live in a world transformed by forces beyond your comprehension or control. Section 4. A world transformed. When the initial waves of blue fire finally subsided, when the worst of the destruction had run its course, and the screaming had died down to exhausted sobbing, you emerged from whatever shelter you had found and looked upon a world that was barely recognizable. The Spellplague had not simply damaged Faerun. It had rewritten it, transforming the familiar into the alien, turning the map you had carried in your head into a worthless collection of outdated information. The changes were everywhere, impossible to ignore or deny. Mountains stood where there had been plains. Seas covered what had once been fertile farmland. Cities you had visited just months before were now smoking ruins, or had vanished entirely, replaced by churning voids of magical energy that hurt to look at directly, and floating above it all were the earth motes, hundreds of them, casting shadows on the ground below as they drifted through the sky like impossible islands divorced from the earth that had given them birth. The map of Faerun had been redrawn by forces that cared nothing for political boundaries or geographic logic. Nations that had existed for centuries were simply gone, erased so completely that even their ruins were difficult to find. Other regions had been expanded or contracted, their borders shifted by miles or hundreds of miles in random directions. The Shar, the great grassland that had stretched across the south of Faerun, was partially consumed by what came to be called the plaguelands. This was a zone where the Spellplague's effects were so intense and persistent that normal natural laws simply did not apply. The ground in the plaguelands glowed with residual blue energy. Gravity fluctuated wildly, sometimes pulling you down with crushing force, and sometimes releasing you entirely so that you drifted upward like a feather on the wind. Creatures that wandered into the plaguelands, if they survived at all, emerged changed in ways both physical and mental. Animals developed impossible anatomies, limbs that bent in directions that should not be possible, or sensory organs that perceived dimensions beyond the normal three. Plants grew to enormous sizes overnight or shrank to microscopic scale. The very air tasted of ozone and copper, and prolonged exposure caused nausea, disorientation, and eventually madness. The underchasm, that massive rift that had been created by the Spellplague's tearing of the earth, dominated the landscape of southeastern Faerun. It stretched for hundreds of miles, a gaping wound in the world's surface that exposed the Underdark to the sky above. The sides of the chasm were sheer cliffs that descended thousands of feet into darkness. Blue fire still flickered along its edges years after the initial catastrophe, and the planar distortions within it made any attempt to cross it extraordinarily dangerous. In the east, the once mighty empire of Mulhorand saw its cities shaken and its people scattered. The nation's god-kings, pharaohs who had ruled for millennia, found their divine powers disrupted by the Spellplague's effects. This could have suggested that the empire's long stable rule was finally vulnerable to change. And indeed, the region experienced significant upheaval in the years that followed. Under Mulhorand's ancient rival suffered even worse devastation. Much of the nation was destroyed outright, and what remained descended into chaos as local governors and warlords fought for control in the absence of central authority. Within a generation, Undr as a political entity had effectively ceased to exist. Its territory divided among various successor states and foreign powers. The Sword Coast, that long stretch of coastline that had been home to so many important cities and trade routes, was altered but remained recognizable. The coastal mountains were reshaped, some peaks leveled while new ones thrust up from the bedrock. Rivers changed course, and with them went the trade routes that had followed those rivers for centuries. Perhaps most dramatically, entire regions simply vanished from the material plane entirely. These areas were not destroyed in the conventional sense. They were displaced, shunted sideways into other planes of existence, or perhaps into pocket dimensions created by the Spellplague's reality warping effects. Travelers who tried to enter these vanished regions would find themselves walking in circles, unable to penetrate beyond a certain boundary, no matter which direction they approached from. Some of these displaced regions eventually returned, years or even decades after the Spellplague. The people who had been trapped within them emerged to find that the outside world had moved on without them. The destruction of entire nations meant that cultures and knowledge accumulated over thousands of years were lost in a matter of days. You need to understand the magnitude of this loss. These were not primitive societies without written language or permanent structures. These were advanced civilizations with rich histories, vast libraries, and unique magical traditions that existed nowhere else in the world. With Halrua's devastation came the loss of magical research and techniques that the Halruan wizards had developed over centuries. Spells that were common in Halrua were completely unknown in other lands, and when Halrua fell, those spells were lost. Magical theory that the Halruans had proven or disproven through extensive experimentation died with them, and other wizards would have to rediscover the same principles through trial and error. The loss was not limited to arcane knowledge. Halrua had also been a center of art and philosophy, home to poets and painters whose works were destroyed when the blue fire consumed their nation. Musical traditions unique to Halrua's culture vanished overnight. Oral histories passed down through generations were silenced when the storytellers died without passing their knowledge to successors. Lantin's destruction meant the loss of technical knowledge about combining magic with mechanical devices and smoke powder technology. The Lantanese had developed clockwork constructs and other inventions that blended the arcane with the mundane in ways no other culture had mastered. When Lantan was destroyed and flooded, these secrets went with it. Future artificers would have to start from scratch, lacking the foundational knowledge that the Lantanese could have provided. Even nations that survived saw massive cultural disruption. Libraries burned, their ancient texts consumed by blue fire, or simply lost in the chaos as people fled for their lives. Temples were destroyed, taking with them religious artifacts and holy relics that had been venerated for centuries. Bardic colleges collapsed, their instructors killed and their students scattered, breaking the chains of teaching that had preserved songs and stories across generations. Languages died out as the populations that spoke them were killed or dispersed. Some languages had been spoken by only a few thousand people in isolated regions, and when those regions were hit by the Spellplague, the languages vanished with them. Future scholars would discover written examples of these extinct tongues and puzzle over their meanings. Unable to fully translate texts because the cultural context in which they were written no longer existed. In the immediate aftermath of the Spellplague, magic barely functioned at all. The weave was gone, and no one knew if it would ever be replaced or repaired. Spellcasters were left powerless, or with abilities so diminished and unreliable that they were nearly useless. For the first time in recorded history, magic was not a force you could count on. But slowly, very slowly, a new form of magical access began to emerge. It was not the weave, not the carefully structured network of energy that Mystra had maintained. Instead, it was something more primal and chaotic, drawing on raw magical energy that still permeated reality despite the weave's destruction. This new form of magic was fundamentally different from what had come before. It was less orderly, less predictable, more difficult to control. Spells that had been simple to cast before the Spellplague now required intense concentration and significant effort. Magic that had once been reliable now carried an element of risk, a chance that the spell would fail or produce unintended effects. The classification of spells into neat levels from 1st to 9th became less meaningful. The mental constructs that wizards had used to organize their magical knowledge no longer mapped cleanly onto the new reality of how magic functioned. Some spells that had been considered low-level before the Spellplague were now much more difficult to cast. Others that had been high-level became easier, their effects more accessible to less experienced casters. Wizards found that they could no longer memorize spells in the same way they had before. The mental patterns that had been so crucial to arcane casting did not form properly anymore. Or if they did form, they dissolved almost immediately based on how magic functioned in this period. we can infer that casting became more intuitive, more about feeling and instinct than about careful calculation and precise execution. This shift appears to have benefited some casters and harmed others. Sorcerers, whose magic had always been instinctive rather than learned, may have adapted somewhat more easily than wizards. They had never relied on the rigid structures that wizards used, and they were more comfortable working with magic that flowed in unpredictable ways. But even sorcerers found the new magic challenging, as the internal currents of power they drew upon had been fundamentally altered by the weave's collapse. Warlocks, those who gained their power through pacts with otherworldly entities, discovered that their patrons were now more demanding and more difficult to please. The barriers between planes had weakened, which meant that powerful beings from other dimensions could exert more direct influence over the material plane. This could imply that some warlocks found their pacts renegotiated, whether they wanted that or not, with their patrons demanding greater service in exchange for power. Divine magic remained more stable than arcane magic, but even clerics and paladins experienced significant changes. The gods, having witnessed what happened when one of their number was murdered, became more protective of their mortal followers. They granted power more selectively, ensuring that those who wielded divine magic were truly devoted and would not abuse the gifts they received. Among the most visible and persistent effects of the Spellplague were the spell scars, marks left on individuals who had been exposed to the blue fire and survived. These were not simple burns or wounds. They were fundamental alterations to a person's relationship with magical energy, changes that persisted for the rest of their lives and sometimes beyond. Spell scars manifested in countless different ways. Some were physical marks, blue or purple lines that traced across the skin in patterns that resembled arcane formulae or magical sigils. These marks glowed faintly in darkness and became brighter when the scarred individual was near sources of magical energy. The marks could appear anywhere on the body, sometimes covering large areas and sometimes forming concentrated designs on specific parts like the hands or face. But the physical marks were only the most obvious manifestation. Spell scars granted abilities, strange powers that were neither true spells nor purely mundane talents. A spell-scarred person might be able to see magical auras without casting any spell, perceiving the flow of arcane energy as colored light visible only to them. Another might find that they could phase through solid walls briefly, or teleport short distances when under stress. Some spell-scar abilities proved useful. There were those who could ignite small fires with a touch, or who could purify water by holding a container and concentrating for a few moments. Others developed minor telepathic abilities, able to send simple thoughts to people nearby, or to sense strong emotions in those around them. But many spell scars were burdensome or even actively harmful. You might develop a spell scar that caused you to randomly teleport short distances when stressed, potentially materializing inside walls or over cliffs. Or you might find that your touch caused metal to corrode and rust, making it impossible to hold weapons or tools. Some spell-scarred individuals leaked magical energy constantly, causing spell effects to go haywire in their vicinity. The worst spell scars were those that affected the mind. Some survivors of the Blue Fire found their thoughts invaded by visions from other planes or other times, glimpses of realities that should not be perceivable. These visions were often incomprehensible and always disturbing, showing landscapes of impossible geometry or beings whose very forms violated the natural order. Prolonged exposure to such visions drove many spell-scarred individuals insane. Society did not know how to deal with the spell-scarred. In some communities, they were treated with fear and suspicion, viewed as corrupted by the spellplague and potentially dangerous. Spell-scarred individuals were driven out, forced to survive on their own or to band together with other outcasts. In other places, the spell-scarred were seen as touched by destiny, marked for some unknown purpose. They were respected or even revered, though this respect often came with expectations of special service or sacrifice. The gods themselves were not immune to the chaos caused by Mystra's death and the Weave's collapse. The divine realm experienced its own upheavals, power struggles, and reorganizations that had profound effects on mortal worshippers. Some gods lost significant power as their portfolios were disrupted by the spellplague. Deities whose domains were closely tied to magic or to specific geographic regions found themselves weakened when those regions were destroyed or fundamentally altered. Followers prayed and received no answer, or received only confused and contradictory messages that suggested their gods were struggling to maintain coherence. Other gods gained power, expanding their influence into domains left vacant by Mystra's death or by other deities who had been weakened. Shar, who had orchestrated Mystra's murder, grew significantly stronger, her dominion over darkness and loss extending as despair and destruction spread across Faerun. She worked to prevent any new goddess of magic from arising, knowing that such a being would threaten her plans. Cyric, despite having killed Mystra, did not gain the power he had expected. His madness deepened further, fed by his failure to claim the magic portfolio, and by his realization that Shar had manipulated him. He lashed out wildly, attacking other gods and mortal followers alike. His church descended into chaos as his clerics received contradictory commands or visions that made no sense. The exact details of what punishment Cyric faced in the immediate aftermath vary in the telling, but his influence on the mortal world became increasingly erratic and constrained. New gods emerged during this period, mortal heroes who had distinguished themselves and attracted enough worshippers to ascend to divine status. These new deities were often more accessible than the ancient gods, more willing to directly intervene in mortal affairs, because they remembered what it was like to be human. But they were also less experienced, less certain of their roles and responsibilities, and sometimes they made mistakes that had terrible consequences for their followers. The faithful struggled to make sense of these divine changes. Temples that had stood for centuries were abandoned when their gods fell silent or died. New temples were built to honor newly ascended deities or gods who had expanded their portfolios to fill vacant niches. Religious philosophy and theology had to be completely rethought, as the old certainties about how the divine realm functioned were proven wrong by events that no scholar or priest had predicted. You learned to be flexible in your faith, to adapt as the gods themselves adapted. The rigid religious structures that had existed before the Spellplague gave way to more personal and immediate forms of worship. People prayed not because tradition demanded it, but because they desperately needed divine aid in a world that had become hostile and strange. The world you inhabited now was one of constant uncertainty and adaptation. Every aspect of life that had seemed permanent and unchangeable had been revealed as fragile and temporary. You could not count on magic, could not trust that the ground beneath your feet would remain solid, could not even be certain that the gods would answer when you called. But you survived, because that is what mortals do. You learned to live in this transformed world, to navigate its dangers and exploit its opportunities. And slowly, generation by generation, you began to rebuild what had been lost. Section 5. Life after the Cataclysm. The years immediately following the Spellplague were years of survival. Nothing more and nothing less. You did not have the luxury of mourning what had been lost or planning for a distant future. Your concerns were immediate and visceral. Where would you find food when farmland had been consumed by blue fire or transformed into barren wastelands? Where would you find shelter when cities lay in ruins and the weather itself seemed to have gone mad, with storms appearing without warning and seasons no longer following their accustomed patterns? How would you protect yourself when the old authorities had collapsed and bandits and monsters roamed freely across the land? The social structures that had held civilization together for centuries broke down almost immediately. Governments fell when their leaders were killed, or when the territories they governed ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Trade networks collapsed when the roads and rivers that had carried commerce were destroyed or rendered impassable. The rule of law gave way to the rule of the strong, with petty warlords and opportunistic criminals carving out little kingdoms from the ruins. In the first months after the Spellplague, you learned to be resourceful in ways that would have been unthinkable in the old world. You scavenged among ruins, searching for food, water, tools, anything that might help you survive another day. You learned which plants were still safe to eat and which had been transformed by the Spellplague into poisonous or mutagenic variants. You discovered that water had to be carefully tested before drinking, because some sources had been contaminated by magical residue that caused sickness or worse. Communities that survived intact or that reformed from scattered refugees developed new ways of organizing themselves. The old hierarchies based on noble birth or magical power were meaningless now. What mattered was who could provide food, who could defend the community from threats, who had practical skills that contributed to survival. A farmer who knew how to coax crops from spellplague-damaged soil was worth more than a nobleman whose lands had been swallowed by the earth. A blacksmith who could forge weapons and tools was more valuable than a wizard who had lost the ability to cast spells. You formed alliances based on necessity rather than affection. Strangers banded together because alone they would die, and together they had at least a chance of surviving. These groups were often fragile, held together only by immediate need, and liable to fracture when resources became scarce or when danger had passed. But some of these temporary alliances evolved into genuine communities, as people who had survived together developed bonds of trust and mutual dependence. The spell-scarred, initially feared and rejected, gradually found places in many communities. Their abilities, however strange or limited, often proved useful in the changed world. Someone who could see magical auras, could warn others away from dangerous zones of residual spellplague energy. Someone who could teleport short distances, could retrieve supplies from places that were otherwise inaccessible. Even abilities that seemed purely harmful could be turned to advantage with creativity and determination. Defense became a primary concern for every settlement. The Spellplague had unleashed countless monsters and displaced creatures from other planes. Aberrations crawled up from the Underdark through cracks opened by earthquakes. Demons and devils crossed over from the lower planes through weakened planar barriers. Even ordinary predators became more dangerous as they adapted to the changed environment, developing new hunting strategies or unnatural cunning. Without reliable magic to defend settlements, you returned to more primitive methods. Walls were built from stone and timber, high enough to keep out most threats. Watchtowers were erected to provide early warning of approaching danger. Militias were organized from anyone capable of holding a weapon, because there were no longer professional armies to call upon for protection. Every able-bodied adult learned at least basic combat skills, knowing that their survival might depend on their ability to fight. Agriculture had to be completely reinvented. The crops that had fed Faerun for generations often would not grow in soil that had been exposed to the Spellplague. You experimented with different varieties of grain and vegetables, testing to see what would thrive in the altered conditions. You learned to recognize the signs that soil had been too heavily contaminated by magical residue, knowing that plants grown in such earth would be inedible or toxic. Some regions developed entirely new agricultural practices. In areas where the ground itself was unstable, floating gardens were created on earth motes, with soil imported from safer locations, and carefully tended to produce enough food for small communities. Near zones where the Feywild overlapped with the material plane, farmers discovered that Fey-touched plants grew with impossible speed, but required careful management to prevent them from overrunning everything else. The decade following the Spellplague's initial outbreak was the worst. The blue fire continued to rage in many regions. New earth motes were torn from the ground, and planar barriers remained dangerously permeable. Magic barely functioned at all during these years, and those few spells that could be cast were wildly unpredictable. The death toll during this first decade was staggering, with entire populations wiped out by continued exposure to the Spellplague's effects, or by the chaos and violence that followed societal collapse. But by the year 1395 Dale Reckoning, a full decade after Mystra's death, most of the Spellplague's active effects began to subside. The blue fire stopped spreading, and in many places began to fade entirely. The creation of new earth motes ceased. Planar intrusions became less frequent and less severe. Most crucially, magic began to stabilize, settling into new patterns that, while different from what had existed before, were at least somewhat predictable and reliable. This stabilization did not mean the Spellplague was over. Areas that had been heavily affected remained dangerous, glowing with residual magical energy and subject to reality distortions. These regions came to be known as plaguelands, zones where the normal laws of nature still did not apply, and where travel remained extremely hazardous. But the plaguelands were contained, no longer expanding or spawning new catastrophes. You could map them, avoid them, and build your life around them rather than constantly fleeing from an ever-spreading disaster. As the years passed and became decades, a new generation of spellcasters emerged. These were people who had come of age in the post-Spellplague world, who had never known the old weave, and therefore had no preconceptions about how magic should work. They were not trying to recreate what had been lost. Instead, they were discovering magic anew, developing techniques and theories that worked with the transformed nature of arcane power. The magic these new spellcasters practiced was fundamentally different from pre-Spellplague traditions. It drew on raw magical energy that still permeated reality, but the methods of accessing and shaping that energy bore little resemblance to the careful formulae and mental patterns that wizards had once used. Spells became more intuitive, more about force of will and innate understanding than about memorized incantations and precise gestures. This new approach to magic had its advantages. Spellcasters found they could use certain abilities repeatedly without exhausting themselves, the way pre-Spellplague wizards had when casting multiple spells in a day. Some magical effects became simpler to produce, requiring less training and less inherent power. But the new magic also had limitations. The most powerful spells remained difficult or impossible to cast, and even experienced spellcasters found that their abilities were constrained in ways that would have frustrated pre-Spellplague archmages. Some spellcasters began to draw power directly from the elemental planes or from the Feywild and Shadowfell, using the weakened barriers between dimensions to their advantage. These casters could produce spectacular effects when conditions were right, but they were also more dependent on their connection to other planes. A wizard who drew power from the plane of fire might find their abilities greatly enhanced near sources of flame, but significantly diminished in cold or wet environments. Others learned to tap into primal magic, connecting with the natural world in ways that druids had done for centuries, but with techniques adapted to the post-Spellplague reality. These primal casters often formed bonds with specific locations or ecosystems, gaining power from the land itself rather than from any external source of magical energy. A few exceptional individuals discovered ways to harness the residual energy from the Spellplague itself. These so-called plague mages could manipulate the blue fire that still burned in plaguelands, shaping it into weapons or shields. They could stabilize areas of wild magic temporarily, creating safe zones where normal spells might function properly. But plague magic was intensely dangerous to practice, and many who attempted it were consumed by the very energies they sought to control. The old magical institutions, those that had survived it all, struggled to adapt to these new forms of magic. Wizards trained in the pre-Spellplague tradition found themselves unable to teach students using methods that no longer worked. Some attempted to preserve the old knowledge, insisting that eventually the weave would be restored and the ancient ways would be relevant again. Others accepted that magic had fundamentally changed and that new traditions needed to be developed to match the new reality. The political map of Faerun was redrawn not just by the physical changes wrought by the Spellplague, but by the collapse of old powers and the rise of new ones. Nations that had been major players before the catastrophe found themselves reduced to insignificance, while upstart kingdoms and city-states seized opportunities to expand their influence. Cormor, the ancient kingdom that had been a beacon of law and stability for over 1,000 years, was badly shaken, but survived, largely intact. The Purple Dragons, Cormor's professional army, had suffered heavy losses during the Spellplague, but enough of the military structure remained to maintain order and defend the nation's borders. The war wizards, though greatly reduced in number and power, continued to serve the crown and helped rebuild the magical defenses that protected the realm. But Cormor was now isolated in ways it had never been before. Neighboring lands had been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition, Cutting off traditional trade routes and alliances, the nation turned inward, focusing on its own recovery and becoming less involved in the wider affairs of Faerun. This isolation allowed Cormyr to recover more quickly than some other regions, but it also meant that the kingdom lost much of the international influence it had once wielded. Waterdeep maintained its position as one of the great cities of the Sword Coast, though it too had been changed by the Spellplague. The city's population swelled with refugees from destroyed communities, creating tensions as resources became scarce, and different cultural groups competed for space and security. The Lords of Waterdeep, the masked rulers who governed from the shadows, worked tirelessly to keep order and prevent the city from descending into chaos. New power structures emerged within Waterdeep to deal with the changed circumstances. Guilds that had focused on magical goods and services either disbanded or reinvented themselves. Criminal organizations grew more powerful as law enforcement struggled to maintain control. The city became more stratified, with wealth concentrating among those who had managed to preserve their resources through the catastrophe, while the poor became poorer and more desperate. They experienced a dramatic transformation in the decades following the Spellplague. Shas Tam, a Lick who had been one of the most powerful red wizards even before the catastrophe, used the chaos to seize complete control of the nation. He eliminated his rivals through a combination of military force and necromantic might, declaring himself the eternal ruler of Thay and transforming the nation into a necrocracy where the undead often outnumbered the living. Under Shas Tam's rule, Thay became even more isolated and sinister than it had been before. The Red Wizards abandoned any pretense of serving the common good, focusing instead on dark research and the acquisition of power by any means necessary. The living citizens of Thay existed primarily to serve the undead elite, their lives valued only for the labor they could provide, and the bodies they would eventually contribute to Thay's ever-growing armies of animated corpses. In the power vacuum created by the destruction of so many established nations, numerous smaller kingdoms and city-states arose. Local warlords declared themselves kings or princes, ruling over whatever territory they could seize and hold. Some of these petty tyrants were brutal despots who oppressed their subjects. Others were genuinely trying to create stable communities and protect their people from the dangers of the post-Spellplague world. Trade, so crucial to civilization, had to be completely reorganized. The old merchant consortiums that had controlled commerce across Faerun were largely defunct, their members dead or scattered, and their trade routes unusable. New merchants arose to fill the void, often former adventurers or soldiers who had the martial skills to protect their caravans from bandits and monsters. These new trade networks were smaller and more localized than what had existed before. Instead of goods flowing freely across the entire continent. Trade occurred between neighboring settlements or regions. Exotic items from distant lands became rare treasures rather than expensive but available commodities. Entire industries that had depended on long-distance trade collapsed, while new industries emerged to serve more localized markets. The cultures of Faerun, shaped over thousands of years, underwent rapid and profound changes in the century following the Spellplague. Traditional values and beliefs were challenged by the new realities of existence. Philosophies and religions that had provided comfort and meaning in the old world often seemed inadequate or even hollow when confronted with the scale of destruction that had occurred. Art and literature reflected the trauma of the Spellplague. Songs and poems from this period were often melancholy or despairing, dwelling on themes of loss and transformation. Visual art became darker, with many works depicting the blue fire and its terrible effects. There was a fascination with ruins and decay, an attempt to come to terms with the fact that everything people had built could be swept away in moments. But there was also defiance in the culture that emerged. Stories celebrated survivors who had overcome impossible odds, heroes who had saved their communities through courage and quick thinking. Ballads praised those who had fought against the chaos and carved out spaces of safety in a hostile world. This defiant streak represented a determination not to let the Spellplague define everything, a refusal to surrender to despair even in the face of overwhelming loss. Religious practice became more personal and less institutional. The great temples that had dominated pre-Spellplague religion were often gone, and the elaborate ceremonies they had conducted were impossible to maintain with reduced clergy and resources. In their place arose simpler forms of worship, small shrines tended by individual priests, or even by laypeople who felt called to serve their gods. You prayed not because the calendar said it was time for a holy day, but because you needed strength to face another difficult day. You made offerings not to fulfill ritual obligations, but to express genuine gratitude for surviving when so many others had died. Religion became immediate and vital rather than formal and distant, and many people felt that they had a closer relationship with their gods in the aftermath of catastrophe than they ever had in times of prosperity. Education, crucial for preserving knowledge and cultural continuity, became informal and practical. The great academies and universities were mostly destroyed or abandoned. Learning happened through apprenticeships and family teaching, with parents passing on their skills and knowledge directly to their children. This meant that some knowledge was preserved while other information was lost, with the selection based more on practical utility than on any broader vision of what future generations might need to know. Languages evolved rapidly as isolated communities developed their own dialects and terms for the new things they encountered. Words from different cultures mixed together as refugees from various nations settled in the same areas and had to communicate despite linguistic barriers. Common, the trade tongue that had been widespread before the Spellplague, fractured into regional variants that were sometimes barely mutually intelligible. The century following the Spellplague was not a steady progression toward recovery. There were setbacks and additional disasters, times when it seemed that things were getting worse rather than better. Plagues swept through populations weakened by malnutrition and living in unsanitary conditions. Wars erupted as different factions fought over resources and territory. New monsters appeared, either mutated by lingering Spellplague energy or crossing over from other planes through barriers that remained dangerously permeable. But slowly, very slowly, stability began to return. Settlements grew into towns and towns into cities. Trade routes were reestablished, though they followed new paths across changed geography. Magical practice became more reliable as spellcasters developed better understanding of how post-Spellplague magic worked. The initial generation of survivors, those who had lived through the catastrophe itself, began to die of old age and were replaced by people who had been born into the changed world and knew no other reality. This new generation adapted more easily than their parents or grandparents had. They took for granted things that the older generation found strange or disturbing. Earth motes floating in the sky were just part of the landscape, not impossible defiances of natural law. Plaguelands were dangerous regions to be avoided, not tragic reminders of what had been lost. Magic that behaved differently than it had in ancient texts was simply how magic worked, not evidence that something fundamental had broken. You learned to live with the scars the Spellplague had left on the world and on yourself. If you were spell-scarred, you found ways to cope with your condition or to use your abilities to your advantage. If you had lost family or friends to the blue fire, you honored their memory, but did not let grief consume you entirely. If your homeland had been destroyed, you built a new home somewhere else and created new connections to replace what had been severed. The world remained dangerous and unpredictable, more so than it had been before the Spellplague. But it was your world, the only one you had, and you were determined to make a life in it despite all the challenges and hardships. You married and had children, raised families, and built communities, pursued dreams and ambitions, even when the odds seemed overwhelmingly against you. Because that is what mortals do. You endure, you adapt, you survive, and eventually, against all expectations, you begin to thrive again, finding ways to flourish even in soil that seemed too poisoned to support life. The Spellplague had changed everything, had taken away the old certainties and replaced them with chaos and danger. But it had not broken the fundamental resilience of mortal spirits, the capacity to keep going even when reason said that all hope was lost. And as the decades passed and became a full century, as the immediate trauma of the Spellplague faded into history and legend, new possibilities began to emerge. The gods stirred, preparing interventions that would reshape reality once again. And you, the descendants of those who had survived the greatest magical catastrophe in recorded history, were about to witness another transformation. One that would partially heal the wounds the Spellplague had inflicted, while leaving permanent scars as reminders of what had been lost. Section 6. Legacy and the Second Sundering. By the year 1400, and 80 Dale reckoning, nearly a full century after the Spellplague had torn reality apart, the world had achieved a kind of equilibrium. It was not the stable, ordered existence that had characterized the age before Mystra's death, but it was no longer the immediate life-or-death struggle of those first terrible years. You had adapted, built new civilizations on the ruins of the old, and learned to navigate a reality that remained fundamentally broken, but at least somewhat predictable in its unpredictability. The blue fire still burned in isolated plaguelands scattered across Faerun. Earth motes still drifted through the skies above transformed landscapes. Magic still behaved differently than it had before the catastrophe, requiring new techniques and approaches from those who dared to wield it. The spell-scarred still bore their marks, visible reminders of the day reality had come undone. These were simply facts of existence now, as immutable as the rising sun or the changing seasons, or so everyone believed. But the gods had not forgotten what had been lost, and they had been working slowly and carefully to repair at least some of the damage that Cyric's mad ambition and Shar's cruel manipulation had inflicted upon the world. The first signs that something significant was about to happen came in the form of prophetic dreams and divine visions, experienced by clerics and oracles across Faerun. These were not the usual cryptic messages that gods occasionally sent to their followers. They were vivid, undeniable revelations that spoke of coming changes, of reality itself being reshaped once more, of wounds being healed and balances being restored. You might have heard these prophecies third hand, distorted by repetition and interpretation, or you might have experienced them directly if you were among the faithful who maintained close connections to the divine. Either way, the message was clear. The gods were preparing to intervene in mortal affairs on a scale not seen since the time of troubles, that earlier catastrophe when deities had walked the earth in mortal form. The reasons for this intervention were complex. Some deities were motivated by genuine compassion for mortals, distressed by the ongoing suffering that the Spellplague had caused and determined to alleviate it. Others were driven by more selfish concerns, seeing opportunities to expand their power or influence in whatever new order emerged from the divine reshaping of reality. But all the gods, even those who rarely agreed on anything, recognized that the current state of affairs could not continue indefinitely. The barriers between planes remained dangerously weak, allowing intrusions from other dimensions that threatened the stability of the material plane. The absence of a true goddess of magic meant that the fundamental infrastructure of arcane power remained broken, patched together with improvised solutions that could fail at any moment. Io, the overgod who stood above all other deities and who rarely intervened directly in divine affairs, had been watching and waiting. He had allowed the other gods to deal with the immediate aftermath of the Spellplague, observing their responses and judging their actions. Now, after a full century, he had decided that the time had come for more direct action. In the year 1482 Dale Reckoning, Io began what would later be called the Second Sundering, a divine intervention that would reshape Toril almost as dramatically as the Spellplague itself had done. The cornerstone of this divine plan was the restoration of Mystra. Without a goddess of magic, without a divine consciousness to maintain and regulate the flow of arcane energy, the weave could never be truly repaired. The improvised magical systems that had emerged in the century since the Spellplague were functional, but inadequate for the long-term stability of reality itself. But bringing back a goddess who had been completely destroyed, whose divine essence had been scattered across the multiverse, was not a simple matter. The process of Mystra's restoration was gradual and complex. Around the year 1479 or 1480 Dale Reckoning, the wizard Elminster Aumer, one of Mystra's most devoted servants, discovered the goddess's essence trapped within the body of a bear in the high forest through means that involved powerful magic and the cooperation of other divine forces. Mystra's divinity was slowly restored over the following years. By 1482 Dale Reckoning, when Io officially began the Second Sundering, Mystra had regained enough of her power to begin the work of reweaving the fabric of magic, but she was not yet fully restored, and the process of rebuilding the weave while the world was still scarred by its collapse required more than just divine power. It required the active participation of mortals and the cooperation of other gods. The Second Sundering unfolded gradually over several years, from 1482 to 1487 Dale Reckoning. Unlike the Spellplague, which had struck without warning and wreaked immediate devastation, the Second Sundering brought changes that were profound, but generally less violent than what had occurred a century before. The year 1482 Dale Reckoning saw the first major event when Baal, the god of murder who had been dead for over a century, was mysteriously reborn in Baldur's Gate. This suggested that the divine order itself was beginning to shift, with dead gods returning to reclaim their portfolios. For Cyric, who had claimed the murder domain after Baal's death during the Time of Troubles, This represented a significant loss of power and influence. In 1400, an 84-Dale reckoning, unusual and disastrous events began to strike Faerun with increasing frequency. Earthquakes shook cities that had known stability for generations. Plagues of locusts devastated crops in southern lands. Droughts caused sea levels to recede in some regions. These natural disasters were symptoms of the fundamental changes occurring as Io began to rewrite the tablets of fate, the divine laws that governed reality itself. The year 1400, an 85-Dale reckoning, brought what became known as the Great Rain. For months, rain fell continuously around the sea of fallen stars, causing the waters to rise dramatically and consuming much of the land that had been exposed. When sea levels dropped during the Spellplague, coastal settlements that had been built on former seafloor were flooded and destroyed. The rain finally stopped in 1400, an 86-Dale reckoning. But by then, the geography of the region had been dramatically altered once again. Major geological instability occurred in 1400, an 87-Dale reckoning. Numerous earthquakes and volcanic eruptions reshaped the landscape. Most significantly, areas that had been consumed by large chasms during the Spellplague, including parts of the Underchasm, were restored to something resembling their pre-Spellplague status. The earth itself was being healed, with divine power filling in the wounds that the blue fire had torn in reality. This was also the year when the worlds of Aber and Toril finally separated once more. Regions that had been exchanged between the two planets during the Spellplague were returned to their original worlds. Mystra, the continent that had vanished from Toril in 1300, an 85-Dale reckoning, reappeared in its former location. Returned Aber, the continent from Aber that had replaced Mystra, vanished back to its home world, taking most of its dragon-born inhabitants with it. Ships began arriving from Evermeet, Lanton, and Nimbrel, lands that had been cut off from the rest of Faerun for a century. The separation of Aber and Toril was not a gentle process. Based on accounts from this period, we can infer that there were massive reality distortions as entire continents phased between worlds. People who had lived their entire lives on what they thought was Toril suddenly found themselves on Aber, while others made the reverse journey. Families were separated across planetary boundaries. Whole cultures that had developed during the century when the worlds were merged were suddenly torn apart. During this tumultuous year, adventurers working under Mystra's guidance managed to infiltrate a location known as the Supreme Throne, the prison where Cyric had been confined after his murder of Mystra. The exact details of how Cyric had been imprisoned vary in the telling, but what is known is that he had been trapped there as punishment for causing the Spellplague. The adventurers released Cyric from his imprisonment, but not to set him free. Instead, this action was part of a complex plan to destroy the Order of Blue Fire, a group that had been drawing power from the residual energies of the Spellplague. With Mystra's aid, these adventurers destroyed the Order of Blue Fire and eliminated the power source that had been sustaining the Spellplague's ongoing effects. This allowed Mystra to fully restore the Weave and her divine realm of Tuiomerheart. For the first time in over a century, magic had a goddess to oversee it once more. The years 1488 and 1489 Dale Reckoning were transitional periods. The winters were notably harsh, and the seasons themselves seemed to shift, starting and ending later than expected. Prayers to deities went unanswered for extended periods, causing confusion and distress among the faithful. The gods' chosen, mortal champions who had been empowered to act on behalf of their deities were still present and active, but the gods themselves seemed distant. This silence was not permanent. By 1489 Dale Reckoning, prayers began to be answered again, but the gods were quieter than they had been before the Second Sundering. They seemed more reluctant to intervene directly in mortal affairs, perhaps having learned caution from the catastrophe that divine interference had previously caused. The chosen of the gods were no longer to be found, their purpose apparently fulfilled with the completion of the Second Sundering. The first and most obvious effect of the Second Sundering was the stabilization of magic. Spells that had been wildly unpredictable began to produce consistent results again. Wizards found that they could prepare spells using mental patterns similar to, though not identical to, those that had worked before the Spellplague. The new weave that Mystra had woven into existence provided structure and reliability that had been absent for generations. You felt this change if you had any magical ability at all. It was like suddenly being able to breathe easily after a century of struggling for air. Spells that had required intense concentration and carried significant risk of failure now came more reliably, their effects predictable and controlled. Magic was still dangerous, as it had always been, but it was no longer chaotic in the way it had been since the Spellplague. The plaguelands began to heal, or at least to stabilize. Regions where the blue fire had burned for decades finally cooled, the raw magical energy dissipating or being absorbed into the newly formed weave. The ground in these areas remained scarred, with unusual rock formations and strange vegetation, but they were no longer actively hostile to life. People could enter former plaguelands without risking immediate transformation or death, though caution was still advised. Some earth motes began to descend, returning to the ground from which they had been torn. This process was not instantaneous or universal. Many earth motes remained floating, either because they had become stable in their aerial positions, or because the divine forces guiding the Second Sundering judged that they should remain as permanent features of the new landscape. But the earth motes that did descend did so gently, settling back into the earth over the course of days or weeks, rather than crashing down catastrophically. The barriers between planes strengthened again, though they did not return to their pre-Spellplague impermeability. The Second Sundering left the multiverse more interconnected than it had been before, with the Feywild and Shadowfell remaining more accessible from the material plane. This was apparently by design rather than accident, suggesting that the gods and Io had decided that completely separating the planes again would require too much effort and might cause additional damage. Geographic changes were complex and selective. Some regions that had been destroyed or dramatically altered by the Spellplague were partially restored. The underchasm was filled in, with the earth itself rising to close the massive rift that had exposed the Underdark to the surface. Rivers that had disappeared were rerouted, sometimes following their old paths, and sometimes carving entirely fresh channels through the landscape. But other changes were left intact. The gods apparently judged that certain alterations had become too deeply embedded in the world's new structure to be safely reversed. Coastlines that had shifted during the Spellplague, and then shifted again during the Second Sundering, stayed in their newest positions. Cities that had been destroyed were not magically rebuilt, though the land where they had stood was often healed so that new settlements could be constructed if mortals chose to do so. The Second Sundering healed many of the wounds the Spellplague had inflicted, but it did not return Faerun to its pre-Spellplague state. The world that emerged was a hybrid, combining elements of the old reality with the transformations that had occurred during the century of chaos. You lived in a realm that carried permanent scars from the greatest magical catastrophe in history, reminders that would persist for generations, or perhaps forever. The spell-scarred individuals did not lose their marks or abilities when the Second Sundering occurred. Their conditions had become fundamental parts of who they were, woven into their bodies and souls in ways that could not be undone without destroying them entirely. Some spell-scarred found that their abilities became more stable and controllable with the restoration of the weave, while others experienced little change. But all of them remained marked, different from normal humans, in ways both visible and invisible. Nations that had been destroyed during the Spellplague were not restored by divine intervention. Halrua remained devastated, though survivors who had been transported to a bear returned when the worlds separated, and they began the long process of rebuilding their homeland from scratch. Lantin re-emerged from wherever it had been hidden or displaced, with ships carrying Lantinese returning to establish contact with the wider world. But the Lantin that returned was different from what had been lost, changed by a century of isolation or displacement. The political map that had been redrawn by catastrophe remained largely intact. New kingdoms and city-states that had arisen during the post-Spellplague period continued to exist rather than being replaced by resurrected versions of what had been lost. Cormor remained strong. Waterdeep continued as a major power. They stayed under Shas Tam's necromantic rule, though the Lich King's power was somewhat diminished by the return of divine order. Cultural changes persisted as well. The century of adaptation had created new traditions, new ways of thinking, new forms of art and literature and philosophy that would not simply vanish because magic had become more reliable again. Languages that had evolved during the period of isolation continued to develop along their own paths. Religious practices that had become personal and immediate did not suddenly revert to the formalized ceremonies of earlier ages, though some temples did attempt to restore older forms of worship. Magic itself, while more stable and predictable than it had been during the Spellplague, never quite returned to the precise state it had occupied before. The new weave functioned differently from the old one in subtle ways. Some spells that had been common before the Spellplague were no longer possible, their underlying principles incompatible with how the new weave was structured. Other spells that had never existed before became achievable, opening new avenues of magical research and application. The gods themselves were changed by what had occurred. They had witnessed the consequences of divine murder and the fragility of reality. When fundamental forces were disrupted, the divine realm reorganized itself, with gods forming new alliances and enmities based on how they had behaved during and after the Spellplague. Many gods who had died or disappeared during the tumultuous century returned to active status. Mystra herself was fully restored, once again overseeing the weave and guiding mortal spellcasters. Helm, the god of guardians who had died during the Spellplague, returned to his divine duties. Mask, the god of thieves, was also restored. Lathander reclaimed his position, and several of the drow deities who had been thought lost returned to answer the prayers of their faithful. Even some of the ancient Mulhorandi gods, whose worship had faded or who had been killed during the Spellplague, were restored to divine status. But not all returns were positive developments. Miakul, the ancient god of death, also came back, complicating the divine portfolio of death and dying. The return of so many deities created a crowded divine realm where power had to be shared among more gods than before. Cyric, whose madness and ambition had triggered the entire catastrophe, remained imprisoned. The exact nature and location of his confinement after the events at the Supreme Throne are not entirely clear, but his ability to influence mortal affairs was severely limited. He remained a god because destroying him entirely might have had unpredictable consequences, but he was effectively neutralized as a major threat to divine and mortal order alike. Shar, the true architect of Mystra's murder, suffered significant setbacks during the Second Sundering. Her plans to transform the weave into a new shadow weave failed when Mystra was fully restored. The destruction of the Netherese flying city of shade, which crashed into Myth Draenor in 1400, and 87-Dale reckoning. Eliminated one of her most powerful mortal factions, Shar lost considerable power and influence, though she remained a major deity. She retreated into the darkness, plotting new schemes, but temporarily checked by the coordinated opposition of other deities and by the restoration of divine order. You live now in a world that exists in the late 15th century Dale reckoning, decades after the Second Sundering. The catastrophe that reshaped reality has passed from living memory for most people, known to current generations primarily through stories told by elders and records preserved in books and chronicles, but its effects remain visible everywhere you look. Permanent alterations to the world that serve as constant reminders of what occurred. Scholars study the Spellplague as one of the defining events of their age, attempting to understand exactly what happened and why. They debate questions that may never be fully answered. Could the catastrophe have been prevented if other gods had noticed Cyric's plot before it was too late? Was Shar's manipulation the only reason Cyric attacked Mystra? Or would his madness have driven him to such action, eventually regardless of external influence? What would have happened if the weave had been allowed to remain broken indefinitely, rather than being restored through the Second Sundering? Wizards analyze the differences between the old weave and the new one, documenting changes in how spells function and developing new theories of magical practice based on these observations. They examine areas that were heavily affected by the Spellplague, studying residual effects and attempting to understand the fundamental nature of the blue fire. Some of this research is purely academic, driven by intellectual curiosity. Other studies are more practical, focused on developing new spells or magical items that take advantage of the changed nature of arcane power. Clerics and theologians debate the moral and philosophical implications of what the gods did and failed to do. Why did Io allow Mystra to be murdered in the first place? Why did the restoration take a full century to begin? What does the fact that gods can die, truly and permanently, mean for the faithful who worship them? These questions challenge traditional religious teachings and have led to new schools of theological thought that emphasize divine fallibility and the importance of mortal agency in shaping destiny. Common people, those who do not spend their lives in academic or religious contemplation, have their own relationship with the Spellplague's legacy. You see it in the earth motes that still float above certain regions, in the spell-scarred individuals who live in your communities, in the ruins of ancient cities that were destroyed and never rebuilt. You tell stories about the Spellplague to your children, cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of even the most fundamental aspects of reality. Some of these stories are accurate, based on genuine historical records or accounts that have been preserved and passed down. Others have become embellished or distorted over time, transformed into legends that contain kernels of truth wrapped in layers of myth and exaggeration. You hear tales of heroes who saved entire cities through their courage and quick thinking during the first days of the catastrophe. You listen to songs about lovers separated by the Spellplague and reunited years later, after harrowing journeys across a transformed landscape. The Spellplague remains a point of reference for understanding other disasters and catastrophes. When earthquakes strike or storms devastate coastal regions, people compare them to the Spellplague, usually saying that whatever current crisis they face is terrible, but at least not as bad as when reality itself came apart. The phrase describing something as worse than the Spellplague has entered common usage as a way of describing the absolutely worst thing imaginable, the catastrophe against which all others are measured. Adventurers and explorers seek out former plaguelands and other areas heavily affected by the Spellplague, drawn by rumors of magical treasures or strange phenomena that might be profitable or interesting to investigate. These expeditions are dangerous because even healed plaguelands can harbor unexpected threats, but they occasionally result in significant discoveries. Ancient magical items that survived the catastrophe are unearthed from ruins. New forms of life that evolved during the century of chaos are documented and studied. You understand the Spellplague as a turning point in history, a moment when everything changed and could never be changed back. It marks the boundary between the world that was and the world that is, a dividing line that separates the age of certainty from the age of adaptation. The older generation, those who remember or whose parents remembered the pre-Spellplague world, sometimes speak wistfully about what was lost. But you and your contemporaries, born into the transformed reality, simply accept the world as it is and make your lives within it. Magic is stable again, but not identical to what it once was. The gods are active, but have been reminded that they are not invincible. Geography has been permanently altered in ways both subtle and dramatic. Cultures have evolved to incorporate the experiences and lessons of surviving the greatest catastrophe in recorded history. This is your inheritance, the legacy of the Spellplague, a world that was broken and has been partially healed, but will always carry scars from its trauma. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps it is good that the world remembers that the evidence of what occurred remains visible for anyone who cares to look. Because the Spellplague taught a lesson that should never be forgotten, reality is more fragile than it appears. The systems and structures you take for granted, the aspects of existence that seem permanent and unchangeable, can be destroyed or fundamentally altered by the actions of those with sufficient power and insufficient wisdom. The world can end, if not completely, then at least the world as you know it. And when it does, you must be prepared to survive and adapt and eventually rebuild. The Spellplague was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, a disaster that killed millions and reshaped an entire world. But it was also a testament to resilience, to the stubborn refusal of mortals to surrender even when faced with impossible odds. You survived. Your ancestors survived. And from the ashes of what was lost, they built something new, something that honored the past while looking toward the future. That is the true legacy of the Spellplague. Not just the destruction it caused or the changes it wrought, but the demonstration that even the worst catastrophe cannot completely extinguish the light of civilization or the determination of those who refuse to let darkness win. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Forgotten Realms' most transformative events, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless other stories waiting to be told, mysteries of lore, and legend that deserve to be explored in depth. Thank you for listening. And until next time, may your own journey through the realms be filled with wonder and discovery.